Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And I hope that you're all having a great week and great end of year. As I film this, we're really coming up towards the end of the year, and this will be the final weekly reads video for this year. Just because the other one falls in that weird period of Twixtmas, as people call it sometimes. I say people, I don't know how many people. Some people do. I don't, but fair play. Anyway, that's beside the point. It falls in that weird period between Christmas and New Year's, and I'm just going to be doing my end of year reading at that point, and I'll be away at some point. So it's just, yeah, we'll just stick with that. But as a result, I just really wanted to talk a little bit about some of the books that I've been reading recently and go from there. There we go. So here is the video. First up, and this weekly reads has been quite an interesting one for me, because essentially a few books have snuck in which I think will be in my best books of the year, and so two of the books I'll talk about today will have that, I think, if not three potentially. The first being Some Men in London, Queer Life 1945 to 1959, and this is volume 1, and I'm just started on volume 2. This is a really incredible selection of material. Essentially, the core idea of this book was that Peter Parker, who I didn't mention, that's the editor, Peter Parker collected together the various contemporaneous accounts of essentially gay men, but queer men overall, who were alive in this time period. And this is very much accounts and pieces of writing and what have you from the time, as opposed to now looking back. So we have everything in here, from poems and short stories and plays and whatever, and extracts of all of those, to people writing into newspapers to say that they didn't believe that people that it should be decriminalized, and all these other things. So you've got these very interesting things side by side with each other, of somebody saying, oh, you know, I went down to a park and there was a man who winked at me, and then it sort of has a wider context around that of importuning laws and things around blackmail and various other things. And so this book does it all in that respect. And volume 2 picks up on that from 1960 to 1969, which is when 67, when decriminalization happened. So it really tries to tell that period of time, and talk about that period of time from the end of World War II to decriminalization in the UK for same-sex acts between men, and what that then meant for many of the people around it. And so it's fascinating, because you see these personal accounts from people who are talking about the most horrendous things happening to them, but also people who are living completely in the face of that, and just going out and exploring who they are and being themselves, and to some degree trying to forge a new path. And I think that's what makes this book so powerful. It's just how many voices are included within this. Next up, I read The Lasting Harm, Witnessing the Trial of Ghislaine Maxwell by Lucia Osborne-Crowley, or Crowley, I think it is. And as you might be able to tell if you know anything about the background to this, and I didn't know a great amount, but it still, it was a lot as a book. This is an incredible piece of writing about something incredibly dark. So Ghislaine Maxwell was the partner and accomplice to Jeffrey Epstein, and so essentially this book is a lot about the trial to bring to justice Ghislaine Maxwell for crimes of trafficking, abuse, and various other horrific things. The book does many things that I think are incredible, and it's basically what I want to say at the beginning of this is an incredibly difficult book to read for several reasons. Even though I've not, very luckily I've not been personally affected by the things that happen in this book, there are a few moments listening to this as an audiobook where I physically had to stop walking and just process a little bit of what I just heard, because some of what comes up is absolutely horrendous. But I think this book's real strength is in taking you through not only the tricky parts of court language, of, you know, what the law means around these things, what it means if somebody says or does something in court, but also goes on to explain so many other things in a really powerful way. So Lucia, through this book, peppers in quite a few personal stories of her own history of experiencing abuse as a child. And she does so in a way that I think is so sensitively done, that she brings in her own story, not to overshadow the people around her, but to give extra credence to the witnesses who are talking about their own abuse, are talking about horrific things happening to them. And she uses that to add context for why they should be believed, or why a thing that some people will use to discount them shouldn't be taken as credible. And I think it's an incredibly bold and brave book. Lucia herself was a court reporter who went to, I think, every day of the trial and reported on everything she'd seen and heard, and she reflects on it in such a powerful way. And even though this book is non-fiction, it almost has I don't want to say thriller aspect, because that feels like it cheapens the story, but there is a propulsion to the writing here that takes you through where even if you know what the outcome is of the trial, you still are kind of holding your heart, you know, holding your breath really to hear what's about to happen next, because of the emotional weight of that moment for the survivors of that abuse. The book then ends with something that I think is really fascinating as well, of examining the after effects of this trial and everything that's come out of it, not only in terms of what law reform should happen to prevent some of the tricky parts that happen for many of the survivors, but also the ways that we as a society do not trust people when they come forward, and how we can make that easier for them. This is an incredibly difficult book to read in many ways, but an incredibly important and powerful one, and it really knocked me over. I think this is an incredibly bold piece of writing, and I think, yeah, will end up in probably in my best of list for non-fiction. I just think it's exceptionally done, and it's so hard to take something that's so difficult and needs to be treated with sensitivity, and to write it in a way that feels accessible and kind. And yeah, I think it's a really brilliant piece of writing, if an incredibly difficult thing to read. Next up, a very different piece of non-fiction, that is Freedom by Angela Merkel, and it's translated, but because it was translated by 8 people, everywhere I look, it doesn't really say the names of those translators. It just says translated by 8 people. So translators out there, we're involved in this. But Angela Merkel being this interesting figure who it's weird as a British person, because for many foreign politicians, particularly European ones, well, particularly ones who aren't from the US, basically, we to some degree know very little about them, because UK news reporting is almost always what's happening in the US and politically, and maybe a little smattering of some other politicians from elsewhere. And Angela Merkel, because of just how long she was Chancellor, appeared quite a lot in our news. But still, it's interesting, because obviously on a policy level, we don't really know a great deal about her. And so it was interesting to read this story from her perspective of what her life has been like, what political machinations she has gone through. And particularly, I don't think I'd appreciated just how long her political career had been. Even before she was Chancellor, obviously you don't just rock up one day and become Chancellor, but she was heavily involved in a lot of local politics as an East German. And obviously for the history of Germany, that's an incredibly important thing, that the Chancellor of a unified Germany is somebody who is from the East, the side that typically, I think, shows up less in politics or in other wider sort of German life, from what I understand. And again, I don't know a great deal about her policies. I don't know if she was somebody who is a politician in the UK if I'd have voted for her, but she's, you know, this important figure in both Europe and sort of global politics, as well as obviously in Germany. And I found it quite interesting just to hear her take on a lot of things and her interactions with many of these political figures, particularly I think as she was the first woman chancellor in Germany, one of the longest serving, if not the longest serving, female politicians I think we've ever had. And she also, I think, has been seen as a fairly unifying figure, at least more globally. I don't know, again, internally within Germany. And it's interesting because I read this not long after having tried to read Boris Johnson's memoirs. And without getting party political on this, Boris Johnson is a figure who I do not like. And I found his memoir really tricky because partly knowing some of the context of what he's talking about made it more complicated, because I would know when he was not telling the truth. Whereas with Merkel, I don't know. She may be lying through her teeth, and I don't know because I don't know German politics inside out. But with the UK situation with Boris Johnson, it was so interesting to see him say these things and realise that it was, you're like, but that isn't how that happened. Or, yes, you say that, but you're missing out some crucial details. And Boris Johnson's memoirs felt a lot more like fiction to me, whereas Merkel's actually did feel very interesting as a person speaking, you know, political figure who's met so many, you know, influential people in the world, and can talk at length about various things that have happened, and various values that she holds, which I think is always an interesting thing with a political memoir or autobiography of any sort, is how they talk about their values and why they made decisions that they did. And that comes through a lot more in Merkel's than it did in Johnson's. But even then, I think it's an interesting read. It is a little long. There are some times where it feels a little slow and it's quite detail oriented, but I still think it's an interesting political memoir regardless. Next up, we have Jean-Baptiste Delamot with The Son of Man, translated by Frank Wynne. And this I thought was an incredible book. It's just a really intense book. I've not read anything else by him, so I don't know how true that is to the rest of his writing. But essentially what we see from the early parts of this book is a set of three people especially that we mostly focus on: a father, mother, and their son. And it's an incredibly fractured and complicated relationship between all three of them. There are fair moments where a lot of violence and difficulty happens across these people. Essentially, a large part of it is that the father has been somewhat vacant and been away. He has abandoned the family for a while and comes back into the life of this family and wants to continue as normal. And that doesn't seem like something particularly possible. But what comes through in the prose of this, and I think this is where a translator like Frank Wynne has really shown just how incredible he can be, because there's a attention to the writing that feels, you know, if you didn't tell me, I could fully be convinced that this was a novel written by an English person, because there's a specificity to the language that is so interesting, where the violence and the brutality of this book is matched in the tone by a sort of detachment, where the book feels so cold and hostile to various actions that are happening. And the prose fully reflects that. Of there'll be a description of something happening and it's done with such a level of dispassionate detachment, and there's no joy, there's no excitement in what's happening. Actions are told and things happen and it's just done. And there's something about the way that this novel is structured and written and framed that turns this tale into something really quite harrowing. It's deeply unsettling in some ways because of that detachment. We are watching a son and father try to connect, but the book itself is holding us off from being able to see any real connection, apart from these little moments that give a window into something that might happen. I think this is really exceptionally done. Even the way that nature operates in this book feels like it's this background thing that's very, really important and that they interact with. But almost there's again, a detachment for everything. I think this is just so bold and clever. I think this is a wonderful novel. This is why I was saying there may be a third book that ends up in my best of from this week, because this book I've been thinking about a lot since I read it, and it's a really interesting book in many, many ways. And last but not least, this is not cheerier. None of the this is another. This book is at least darkly comic. Let's go for that. On the Greenwich Line by Shady Lewis and translated by Katharine Halls. And this book, I mean, I said it was sort of darkly funny. It has a lot of darkness to it, though. It's largely about essentially some combination of state control, unwieldy admin, grief, and various other things. So we have a character who has just watched as somebody he knows has died, and he's trying to deal with the aftermath, but also deal with the drudgery of dealing with some of that admin or trying to process the logistical aspects of that. On top of that, he is also fairly insecure about his own place within the UK in some ways, the way he's treated externally, the way he worries about what his future looks like. All of those things come together in quite a dark thing around this book, but it's also oddly funny. There's a gallows humour to this book that is really quite intoxicating at times. I think this is a really clever and really fun book, despite being so dark and so upsetting in its other ways. It's a really, yeah, I think really very well done at capturing a voice, and particularly something that I find quite interesting and surprising is because a lot of this book is around the UK. There's something about reading a book that's been translated, but that is happening inside the UK. So a book about the UK not written in English feels quite interesting as a British person, particularly around London, to have this other language talking about it and having to only read that through a translation. It's really interesting, and particularly because of how that relates to the plot, where there is an intangibility to Britain because of language barriers or whatever else, and in some ways form and function reach each other in different ways, where there's something quite fascinating about reading how somebody living in the UK would think about the UK in another language that's then translated into English, but the book itself is dealing with so many of those mistranslations and those misunderstandings between things. So I thought a very interesting book, and yeah, a very darkly funny one, a very short book, but one that I think is well worth reading. And so those are the books I've been reading this week. I hope you are doing well. Hopefully whatever you're reading is cheerier than what I've been reading this week. But I hope you're having a great time. I hope you have a wonderful break if you have one, and speak to you all very, very soon. Take care. Bye-bye.